People love to talk about what's lurking in the deepest parts of our oceans. But in 2023, something far worse was discovered in the caves of Namibia, something that had been growing, evolving, and waiting for centuries. This is the story of how Diana Foster, a cave tour guide with 20 years of experience, uncovered a horror that would eventually require intervention from organizations that officially don't exist. It started on a spring morning in May 2023. Diana was doing her routine inspection of the newly discovered section of Dragon's Breath cave system. The massive underground network had recently revealed deeper chambers, extending far beyond what any previous survey had suggested. Diana remembers thinking how the limestone formations looked somehow different here, more organic, almost flesh-like in their texture. She had been leading tours in these caves for 2 decades, working for Namibian cave expeditions, one of the few operators permitted to bring tourists into this remote wonder. But in all her years of experience, she had never seen anything quite like what she found that morning. It began with the bats. Diana noticed something odd about their roosting clusters. They seemed misshapen, bulging in unusual ways. When she aimed her high-powered flashlight at them, she saw it. Extra teeth. Not just 1 or 2, but dozens of them, erupting from their wings, their backs, even their eyes. Some were still alive, somehow, despite their grotesque mutations. I convinced myself it was some kind of calcium disorder, Diana would later tell in her recordings. Something in the water, maybe, affecting their bone growth. I was trying to be scientific about it, rational. But rationality couldn't explain what she found next. Deep in one of the new chambers, she discovered a cave cricket, still moving, but its body was almost entirely encased in what looked like dental enamel. Its legs had been replaced by tiny, perfectly formed human teeth. Over the next few weeks, Diana documented more cases. Cave fish in the underground lake system with multiple rows of teeth, not just in their mouths, but running down their sides. Blind cave spiders with mandibles that had split and multiplied, forming crystalline patterns of incisors and molars. She kept her discoveries quiet at first, collecting specimens and taking photographs. But when she tried to review the images later, she found her camera's memory card had been corrupted, filled with what looked like white, tooth-like structures that had somehow grown through the digital files themselves. The turning point came when Diana decided to investigate local folklore about the cave system. In the archives of a small regional museum, she found references to an old tribal legend about a mouth that devours mouths. The story described a creature that would steal teeth from its victims, using them to grow and multiply. Diana spent 3 days in the museum archives, poring over yellowed documents and faded photographs. The more she read, the more her blood ran cold. The legend of the mouth that devours mouths wasn't just one story, it was dozens, spanning centuries. Portuguese explorers in 1847 described finding walls of teeth in the caves. A German geologist in 1912 documented living calcium formations. All of them disappeared shortly after making their reports. But it was a journal from 1886 that made Diana's hands shake. A local tribal elder had drawn something in the margins. A creature with 4 legs, its body seemingly made entirely of teeth and gums. The accompanying text described how it had emerged from the caves during a drought, taking half the village's children. Not eating them, the elder wrote, but making them smile and smile until they split open like ripe fruit. Diana knew she should alert authorities, but her scientific curiosity got the better of her. After 20 years of studying cave systems, she had never encountered anything like this. As a field researcher, she felt obligated to gather more evidence before making any official reports. It was the kind of professional dedication that had earned her reputation in the field, and would ultimately prove fatal. The next morning, she entered the cave system alone. Her plan was methodical. Collect samples, take photographs, document everything. She brought extra batteries for her lights, sample containers, and her camera. Standard protocol for unusual geological findings. But what she would find was far from geological. The new chamber she discovered wasn't on any map. The walls were wrong. What she had initially taken for limestone formations were actually massive teeth, some as large as cars, growing in spiraling patterns. They were warm to the touch. Some were still growing, making soft clicking sounds as they expanded. In her final recovered voice recording, captured on her backup digital recorder, Diana's professional tone remained steady despite what she was seeing. Old formations appear to be dental in nature, massive structures of what seems to be enamel and dentin. Scale is unprecedented. Temperature reading suggests active growth. This can't be natural formation. This is... The recording cuts off there. The horror of the realization she is dealing with something otherworldly came with an even worse discovery. In a chamber deep below the underground lake, Diana found them. The missing spelunkers from last year's expedition, or what was left of them. Their bodies had been transformed into grotesque sculptures of teeth and bone, forever frozen in expressions of multiple, overlapping smiles. The thing that did this to them wasn't gone. It had never left. Diana caught only a glimpse of it, a massive quadrupedal form moving through the darkness, its body a writhing mass of dental structures. But a glimpse was all it took. When the rescue team found Diana 3 days later, she was still alive, still smiling. The teeth had already begun growing inside her throat. The cave system was officially closed due to structural instability. Black vehicles arrived in the night. Men in tactical gear descended into the darkness. But they weren't looking for survivors anymore. They were hunting something. Today, Dragon's Breath Cave remains sealed. The locals whisper that at night you can sometimes hear something moving deep underground. Something that's still growing, still hungry, still smiling. But Diana Foster's last coherent words, before the teeth took her speech away, might be the most chilling part of all. She wasn't screaming about the monster she'd seen. Instead, she was trying to warn them about what she'd realized in those final moments. That this wasn't just one creature's lair. It was a nursery. If you're enjoying these SCP tales, please like the video, subscribe to the channel for more of these terrifying encounters. In the winter of 1912, a landlord in Stuttgart discovered something horrifying in his basement apartment. But this discovery wasn't just about what he found in that dark space beneath his home. It was about what had been living there all along, patiently waiting, watching, and feeding on his tenants. What happened in that basement would later become one of the most disturbing cases in the region's history, though few would ever know the full truth of what occurred there. Heinrich Weber had inherited his grandfather's 3-story house in Stuttgart's Old Quarter, a neighborhood known for its tight-knit community of working-class German families. The house itself was unremarkable: weathered brick, steep roof, and a basement apartment that Heinrich's grandfather had converted decades ago to generate extra income. What was remarkable, however, was how quickly Heinrich's tenants seemed to leave, or more accurately, disappear. The first disappearance hardly raised any suspicions. Marie Krauss, a young seamstress, had moved into the basement apartment in early 1911. She was quiet, paid her rent on time, and kept to herself. Then, one day in March, she simply wasn't there anymore. Her belongings remained, but Marie had vanished. The police investigated, of course, but concluded she had likely run off with a suitor, and it wasn't uncommon in those days for young women to leave without notice. The second disappearance was harder to explain. Friedrich Müller, a middle-aged bookkeeper who moved in that summer, lasted exactly 3 months before he too vanished. This time, Heinrich found the apartment in slight disarray, a chair overturned, some scratches on the wall that he didn't remember seeing before. But again, the police found nothing suspicious enough to warrant a serious investigation. It was during the third tenant's stay that Heinrich began noticing things, strange things. Anna Schmidt, an elderly widow, had moved in during the early winter months. She was a pleasant woman who often shared stories about her childhood in Bavaria, including old folk tales that made Heinrich oddly uncomfortable, especially the ones about a creature that made clicking sounds in the night. 2 weeks after Anna moved in, Heinrich began hearing it. A rhythmic clicking sound, like someone slowly cracking their knuckles, one finger at a time. At first, he convinced himself it was just the old pipes in the walls, or perhaps the house settling in the cold. But there was something about the rhythm that felt intentional. Always the same pace, always late at night. Heinrich started having trouble sleeping. The clicking seemed to be getting louder, more persistent. Sometimes he'd wake up at 3 in the morning, drenched in cold sweat, certain he could hear it coming through his floorboards. When he'd gather the courage to check on Anna, she'd always be sound asleep, or at least her light would be off. But the clicking never stopped. One evening, Anna came up to Heinrich's apartment, more agitated than he'd ever seen her. She kept glancing over her shoulder as she spoke, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl. "The clicking," she whispered. "It's like in the old stories my grandmother used to tell, about the Zeit picker, the time picker. She said when you hear its clicking, it's counting down your moments, deciding when to strike." She laughed nervously, trying to play it off as silly superstition, but Heinrich could see the genuine fear in her eyes. 3 days later, Anna disappeared. This time, Heinrich couldn't ignore it anymore. The police came again, but their investigation felt perfunctory at best. 3 disappearances in 1 year from the same basement apartment. Surely that warranted more than a cursory look around. But the officer just shrugged and suggested Heinrich be more careful about screening his tenants. That night, as Heinrich lay in bed, the clicking seemed different. Slower, more purposeful. He realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from the basement anymore. It was coming from his stairwell. For the first time, Heinrich considered the possibility that whatever had happened to his tenants might happen to him too. The next morning, Heinrich did something he'd been avoiding for months. He decided to thoroughly inspect the basement apartment himself. As he descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, he noticed something odd about the air. It smelled wrong, like old meat left too long in the sun. The apartment appeared normal at first glance. Anna's belongings were still there, just like Marie's and Friedrich's had been. But as Heinrich moved through the space, he began noticing details he'd somehow missed before. The scratches on the walls weren't random. They formed patterns, like something had been methodically marking time. And they were everywhere, some hidden behind furniture, others in plain sight. Then he saw the closet door. It was slightly ajar, and there was something about its dark opening that made his skin crawl. As Heinrich approached, the clicking started again, but this time it was coming from inside the closet. Heinrich reached for the door handle, his hand trembling. Later, he would have no memory of actually opening the door, only what he found behind it. The closet had been converted into a crude nest, its walls covered in deep grooves and scratches. Scattered across the floor were bones, human bones, picked clean and arranged in neat piles. And in the corner, something moved. Heinrich saw it only for a moment. A tall, thin figure with a body like a man but a head like a bird, its neck moving in impossible ways as it turned to face him. Its beak opened, revealing nothing but darkness inside, and for the first time since Heinrich had begun hearing it, the clicking stopped. He ran. Up the stairs, out of the house, into the street, screaming for help. His neighbors found him babbling about a monster in his basement, about clicking sounds and missing tenants and bones. The police came again, this time with more interest, but when they searched the basement apartment, they found nothing. No bones, no nest, no creature. Even the scratches on the walls had vanished. Heinrich never returned to his house. He spent the rest of his days in an asylum, telling anyone who would listen about the thing that lived in his basement, counting down its victims' remaining moments with its endless clicking. Most wrote him off as mad, but there were some, especially among the older German nurses, who would cross themselves whenever they heard his story, remembering old rhymes their grandmothers used to sing. Tick-tock, the cuckoo clock ticks. As ticks the time, so ticks your heart. They say the house still stands in Stuttgart's old quarter, though it's changed hands many times over the years. Heinrich died in that asylum in 1947, still muttering about the clicking sounds. Today, that basement apartment in Stuttgart's old quarter remains empty, not because of Heinrich's story, that's long been forgotten, but because every tenant who's tried to live there has reported the same thing. At night, they hear something in the walls, moving vertebra by vertebra, counting down to something they never lived to see.